My business partner stood up in front of 40 investors, pointed at me, and said I'd been stealing from our own company for a year. I was holding the exact spreadsheet that proved she was wrong, and she didn't know it yet. She smiled at the room like she'd already won. I smiled back, because I had spent 6 months waiting for that smile. Welcome back to Quiet Reckonings, the channel for people who never raised their voice and still won everything. If you've ever been blamed for the thing someone else did, stay until the end, because the ledger doesn't lie, and neither do I. Let me take you back to the beginning, before the boardroom, before I understood what my sister-in-law was actually capable of. My name is Renata Cole. I'm 38. I run the finance side of a boutique event design company called Marlowe & Cole, based in Charleston. My business partner is Ivy Marlowe, my husband's younger sister. She's the face of the company, warm, magnetic, the one clients fall in love with in the first 5 minutes. I'm the one who makes sure the check's clear. We built this thing from a rented storefront 8 years ago, and for a long time, I believed we built it as equals. I should tell you something about myself so the rest of this makes sense. I grew up the daughter of a man who went bankrupt twice and blamed everyone but himself both times. I learned early that the person who keeps the records is the person who survives the story. So when Ivy asked me to run finance instead of splitting it with her, I didn't see it as being sidelined. I saw it as being trusted. That trust is the reason it took me so long to notice what was happening under my own roof. It started small, the way these things always do. A vendor invoice that didn't match the contract. $400, easy to write off as a rounding error. Then a client deposit that hit our account 2 weeks late, with no explanation in the shared drive. Then a florist we'd used twice suddenly refusing to take our calls, and when I asked Ivy why, she said, "Oh, I switched us to someone better." Don't worry about it, in the tone people use when they want you to stop asking. I didn't stop asking, I just stopped asking her. I started keeping a second file. Not hidden exactly, just mine, a spreadsheet on my personal laptop, separate from the shared company drive, logging every discrepancy with the date, the amount, and a screenshot. I told myself I was just being thorough. I've been an accountant for 15 years. Thoroughness is supposed to be boring. It stopped being boring the night I found the wire transfer. It was for a client wedding at the old rice mill downtown, a job worth $82,000. The client had paid in full. I had the confirmation email myself. But when I reconciled the account that quarter, only $61,000 had ever landed in Marlowe & Cole's operating account. $21,000 had gone somewhere else, routed through a vendor account I didn't recognize, a company called Birdsong Events LLC. I'd never heard of Birdsong Events. I'd built the vendor list myself. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 at night with my laptop open and my husband, Theo, asleep upstairs, Ivy's own brother, and I felt something very specific settle into my chest. Not panic. Something colder and steadier than panic. I registered Birdsong Events in my head the way you register a smell of smoke before you see any fire. 2 days later, at the office, Ivy handed me a stack of receipts for what she called float expenses, and asked me to just process them without the usual line-item breakdown. To save time before the Hartwell Gala, I looked at those receipts and I looked at her, and I said, "Sure," and I processed exactly none of them without a breakdown. I photographed every page first. If you've ever smiled at someone across a desk while doing math in your head that would end their life as they know it, tell me in the comments. I promise you're not alone. Here's where it stopped being about missing money and became something worse. I pulled the incorporation filing for Birdsong Events, LLC, through the state business registry, a public record anyone can search if they know to look. The registered agent's address matched an apartment complex on the north side of town. The listed manager was a name I didn't know, until I cross-referenced it against our own HR files and found it was the maiden name of Ivy's fiancée's sister. A shell dressed up just enough to survive a glance. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't triumph. It was grief. Ivy had been at my wedding. She'd held my daughter 20 minutes after she was born. And somewhere in the last year, she decided that skimming money off our own clients through her fiancé's family was worth more to her than any of that. I didn't confront her. I know how that sounds. But confrontation without proof is just a fight, and Ivy has never lost a fight she got to narrate. So instead, I did what I've always done. I documented every invoice discrepancy, every late deposit, every vendor switch that rooted through Birdsong. Over 4 months, the second spreadsheet grew from a page to 11 pages, each entry timestamped, sourced, and backed with a screenshot or a bank statement. I built it the way I build anything that has to survive scrutiny, assuming someone smarter than me would eventually try to tear it apart. Meanwhile, life at the company kept performing normalcy. Ivy posted about our 8 incredible years together on the company Instagram, tagging me in a photo from our first storefront with the caption, "None of this happens without my sister." I liked the post. I have never in my life liked a post with less of my actual heart behind it. Then came the moment that told me this wasn't carelessness anymore. It was a plan with an exit built in. I overheard her on a call in the supply closet, door not quite shut, telling someone named Cal that once Marlowe and Cole gets absorbed into the new group, none of this paperwork matters anymore. We start clean. I didn't know what the new group was. I found out 3 weeks later when a courier delivered a term sheet to our office, addressed only to Ivy, from a regional event conglomerate called Halstead Collective. They were offering to acquire the company. The valuation was based on our current revenue numbers that were $21,000 lighter than reality because of Birdsong, and probably a great deal more than that. Once I started really looking, I understood then what she was building. Skim the company quietly, let a buyer undervalue what's left because the books look softer than they are, cash out through the sale, and let the shell company evaporate before anyone thinks to trace it. If the deal closed, my half of 8 years of work would be sold out from under me for less than it was worth. By the very numbers I was the one legally responsible for signing off on. If it later came out that funds had been diverted, guess whose signature was on every financial statement? Mine. That's when the second file stopped being a precaution and became a case. I called an old friend from grad school, Priya Anand, who now works forensic accounting for a firm downtown. I didn't tell her it was about Ivy at first. I just said I had irregularities in a small business and needed a second set of eyes before I said anything to my partner. Priya looked at 4 months of my spreadsheet in one sitting, went quiet the way professionals go quiet when they've seen something they take seriously, and said, "This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, Renata. This is structured. Someone built this to survive a casual audit." She agreed to help me formalize it, proper documentation, chain of custody on every record, nothing I'd pulled that couldn't be independently verified. I became 2 people that month. One of me sat across from Ivy at Sunday dinners, passed the salt to her fiancé, admired her wedding dress swatches. The other me sat up past midnight cross-referencing bank routing numbers with Priya's notes, building a file that could stand in a room full of lawyers and not flinch. The mistake, when it came, wasn't subtle. Ivy has never been subtle when she feels safe. 3 days before the Halstead Collective's site visit, she sent an email, company-wide, to the entire staff, CCing Halstead's acquisitions lead by accident. The kind of accident that happens when you're moving too fast to double-check a distribution list. In it, she wrote that once the sale went through, Renata's role gets restructured out, obviously. She was never really client-facing anyway. She'd been planning to erase me from my own company before I'd even seen the offer. And she'd copied the buyer on the confession. I printed that email. I printed it twice. The site visit landed on a Thursday. 40 people in our largest studio space, Halstead's acquisition team, their outside counsel, our staff, and Ivy in a cream blazer. Walking investors through slides about sustainable growth, while I sat near the back with a folder on my lap that weighed considerably more than paper should. She saw me toward the end of her presentation and must have decided the safest move was to get ahead of a story she didn't know I already owned. She stopped mid-slide, looked at me, and said it in front of everyone, that certain financial irregularities in the company's history traced back to me. That she'd been protecting the business from decisions I'd made without her knowledge, and that she wanted that on record before the acquisition closed. The room went very still, the way rooms do when someone says something designed to detonate. I did not raise my voice. I stood up, walked to the front, and asked Halstead's counsel if I could speak for 2 minutes. I opened the folder. I laid out the Birdsong Events Incorporation record first, the registered agent's address, the connection to Ivy's fiancé's family. Then the $21,000 from the rice mill wedding, side by side with the client's paid-in-full confirmation. Then 11 more instances across 4 months, each one sourced, each one time-stamped. Each one independently reviewed by a licensed forensic accountant, whose name and license number were printed on the cover page. Then last, I read 2 lines from the company-wide email Ivy had sent 3 days earlier. The one where she'd already decided to write me out of the business she was currently accusing me of stealing from. "I'm not here to argue with my partner," I said. "I'm here to correct the valuation your firm is about to base an acquisition on." Nobody in that room said a word for what felt like a very long time. Halstead's lead counsel closed her laptop, not out of anger. Out of instinct, the way you close a laptop when you realize the deal you flew in for no longer exists in the shape you thought it did. What happened next moved fast, the way things move once the truth stops needing anyone's permission. Halstead's counsel requested an immediate pause on the acquisition pending independent audit. Ivy's own attorney, present in the room, asked to speak with her privately before she said another word, which is a particular kind of silence all on its own. Priya's documentation, built to survive exactly this moment, did not need a single correction. Ivy didn't scream. She's never been a screamer in public, only in private, where our mother-in-law once told me, gently, that Ivy just processes things loudly. She doesn't mean it. She stood very still in her cream blazer, while 40 people watched the story she'd spent a year writing collapse in real time, and she said only one thing to me. Quiet enough that only I heard it, "You were supposed to be on my side." "I was," I said. "For 8 years. You're the one who left." The state's Business Fraud Division opened a formal inquiry into Birdsong Events LLC within the month, following the referral Priya and our attorney filed jointly. The Halstead acquisition was restructured entirely, this time with an independent audit baked into the terms. And it closed 6 weeks later at the company's true value, not the discounted number Ivy's version of the books had produced. My severance from that restructuring, as the partner who'd actually been protecting the company's assets, was not a severance at all. It was a controlling stake in the new entity, with Ivy bought out of her share entirely, per the terms her own fraud had triggered. She did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't the kind of story where everyone gets what feels satisfying on a screen. The Birdsong money was repaid in a civil settlement, structured over 3 years, and the criminal referral is still, as of this recording, sitting somewhere in a prosecutor's queue that may or may not ever move. Justice, when it's real, is often slower and smaller than we want it to be. What I got instead was simpler, and, in its own way, more permanent. The company we built no longer has her name on the door, and it never had to be a scene from a movie to get there. It just had to be true and provable and patient. Theo didn't speak to his sister for 4 months. He speaks to her now, carefully, the way you speak to someone you loved before you fully understood them. I don't speak to her at all, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Grief without a funeral is still grief. I let myself feel it exactly once, the night the audit closed, sitting in my car in an empty parking garage, and then I drove home to my daughter and did not bring it inside with me. The company is smaller now than it might have been under Halstead. It is also, for the first time in 3 years, entirely mine to be honest about, Every invoice matches every deposit. Every vendor is one I chose. I check, because checking is not paranoia when you've already been right once. It's just good bookkeeping, and it turns out that's the only kind of love language I ever really had to offer. If you've ever been the one blamed for a mess someone else made, and you sat there quietly building the file instead of raising your voice, tell me in the comments where you were. I read every one of them. Would you have called her out in that boardroom the moment you found the shell company, or would you have waited, the way I did, until the truth could survive being questioned by everyone in the room? That's my story. One shell company, one accidental email, and a ledger that finally got to speak for itself. If this reached you, share it with someone who's still keeping their own quiet file. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.